So the cool thing about being able to give the CETF talk here is that M2M is highly international. You know, it's not specific to the United States, even though we have a lot of driving forces in the United States. It's prominent everywhere. Obviously Europe, Asia, even the Middle East and Africa. So I was really glad to do it on an international stage, and I'm very proud to be here. But I kind of want to change the talk title because this is really what M2M is all about, right? It's about hacking anything and everything that you can get your hands on. And that's why this information and this technology is so interesting, because we're talking about innovation in a completely new light, right? This isn't just about hacking, you know, your old laptop or even your phone. This is about hacking pretty much anything that can be digitized. And I'm going to show you some surprising things that are going to be digitized, not only now, but in the near future. So I want to briefly just say who I am and what I'm all about. So my name is Don Bailey, as you heard, and I am a founding partner of Capitol Hill Consultants, which is an engineering organization. We focus on cellular and embedded and all that kind of good stuff. But we were founded almost a year ago. We're not even a year old. But we got our start thanks to the DARPA CFT project. So I feel very proud to be a participant in that. So I have to give them a brief shout out. If you don't know what DARPA is Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency in the United States, where it's primarily military and Defense Department oriented. But they do look at international research that's for the benefit of everyone. That may sound strange because it's a military branch, but their idea here is that if we secure technology within the United States, it's secure everywhere, and the more people that are secure, the less risk there is, and the less likelihood there is for abuse worldwide. So they fund projects like mine in order to understand what is the threat surface of emerging technology, how do we contain risks, mitigate some of these vulnerabilities, and provide researchers with a way to innovate without creating negative platforms of use. So it's pretty exciting stuff, and DARPA has done some excellent things in the past, and they'll do excellent things in the future. So the project that we were given a grant for is the M2M Risk Assessment Project. And of course the idea behind this is we say, what is M2M and how does M2M become secure, right? Obviously that's a very difficult thing, because if M2M really is about all the things, or as it's also called, the Internet of Things, how do you really classify and contain what M2M actually is? And I've given several talks before, especially here at Black Hat, on hacking M2M technology. But I could really never put my finger on what exactly is it. So the idea was that we go out and we analyze what does the industry say it is. There are a lot of books written by very prominent engineers who are extremely experienced and intelligent, but they say something completely different from what we see in practice. They'll say M2M is, a widget that provides internet capability to some legacy system. Yes, that's true. But that's a very simplistic understanding of what it is. M2M is the interconnection of all things with the digital network of all things. So I want to talk a little bit about what that actually means in the context of products. And this Parrot device you see on the right here is a perfect example. So I'm going to give you some examples of what M2M is, and then we'll define what M2M means in a bit. So the first goal, obviously, was just defining, like I said, what exactly is M2M. And a couple of really excellent examples are emerging technology in several weird areas that we never really thought that we'd see digitized. One that I think is a bit awesome is concussion sensors. So everybody here is familiar with American football, I'm sure. So it's not as elegant as, football as everyone else knows it. It's basically just men smashing into each other at unnecessarily high rates of speed for humans to impact with each other. But basically, there's a very, very high rate of injury in American football. And so there have been an unnecessary rash of insurance issues recently because people don't really know how to deal with this. I mean, people have been playing American football for decades, but nobody's actually stepped up to say, hey, I have a physical ailment as a result of this. But technology has gotten us to the place where we know there is causality, and they're starting to say, okay, well, we need a way to diagnose whether or not this is occurring. Well, concussion sensors are a brilliant way of doing this. You put a concussion sensor in the individual's helmet, the player's helmet, and now if impact occurs at a certain pressure, then you can say it's very, very likely that this individual has incurred some kind of a concussion. And then you can take that player off the field or whatever. That's a significant advancement in medicine technology, because now that enables us to ensure that somebody that needs treatment gets treatment right away. Whereas, with a concussion, if you don't treat it, it can cause death, blindness, all sorts of other crazy ailments that you just don't want to deal with. And that causes, of course, the bottom line to get more and more expensive. Another really excellent example is plant nutrient monitoring. So I have the parrot right here. Again, it's just a little stick, basically, that you stick in the ground. And it monitors the nutrients in the soil and how they're uptaked by the plant. So the plant you can measure whether or not the plant is taking enough nutrients, nitrogen, whatever, whether it's getting enough light, enough moisture, etc. So it's actually a brilliant system at a pretty decent price, but we're going to see prices like these go down. What's exciting about this technology isn't just that you have some novelty that you can stick in a home house plant. What's exciting is that you can actually use this to grow crops in an urban setting where now you have lower income individuals that don't have access to fresh vegetables. You can use simple technologies like these to help increase production and cultivation rates and success, so that people in low-income facilities now have access, or cheaper access, or even free access to vegetables and things that will help them stay healthier. In America, that's a serious problem, because we have a very, very high instance of individuals with low income not being able to get healthy food, because the lowest cost food is going to be McDonald's, Burger King, KFC, all the things that are going to make them worse, which also makes them worse workers, right? So that's a significant problem. And simple things like these are changing the way that society sees not only technology, but the way that we interact with the physical world and how it makes us healthy or makes us less healthy. But I can talk about all the examples, blah, 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 on what M2M is and why it's interesting. But I want to say what it's not. And it's not just a simple sensing technology. Obviously, there's sensing involved. I want to know how much light there is, whether enough nutrient is getting uptaked, whether a concussion occurred, blah, blah, blah. That's true. But that isn't important, because you're not going to say to me, Don, well, it sounds like you're just protecting, whether there's enough light outside to grow a tomato. That's not interesting. And that's true, that's not interesting. What is interesting is the result. So it's far more complex. What you're protecting in M2M is the analysis of the data coming from these particular sensors and devices that allow interaction with the physical world. And this is a perfect example of monetizing on security vulnerabilities in this kind of technology. So in America, as I'm sure elsewhere, I'm not as familiar elsewhere, but we have a very big gambling industry associated with professional sports in America. I'm sure that's true of everywhere. But in the United States, what would be really interesting is taking this new concussion technology and using a CC1111 to spoof a message from somebody's helmet at a precise time. So say you're in the stands, you're watching an American football game, you see a collision occur, and you hit a button on your little Chronos watch that emits a signal from a CC1111. Now you say, hey, I am the quarterback, and I just had a severe concussion. Probably. The helmet's going to send that signal, or your spoof signal is going to end up at the receiver, the base station, that says, the quarterback just got impact, we need to check him. They're going to take him off the field and get him into a doctor situation so that he can be checked out, okay? And that means he's off the field, he may not be able to make key plays, and if he's a really important part of that team, the next thing you know, boom, you may have just lost the game. And that's going to make me money. So the interesting thing here is the effect of how these new technologies can be usurped. So it's not always about what's sensing, right? It's about the results and how the results can be skewed or made to fail in interesting and predictable ways, right? So that to me, and the research says, this is what M2M is all about. Another very, very cool piece of technology. How many people are familiar with this? Botanicus interacticus. One person. Anybody else? You? Did I see your hand go up? No? Okay, at least one person, which I'm very happy about, because this is probably one of the coolest things I've ever seen. And it's definitely, to me, the most innovative thing in the last 10 years. Botanicus interacticus is turning plants into user interfaces. So basically what you're able to do is create capacitive touch interfaces by sending a signal or multiple signals through the plant's roots. And you can do this with just simple plates in the ground. Okay, so you take a couple copper plates, you stick them in the soil near a plant, and it can be, a couple of feet from the roots. But what occurs is a signal goes through the plant, and the plant acts as a set of in-series capacitors and resistors. When you touch a certain part of the plant, you will change the signal that occurs through the plant in a predictable way, which means that you can read the result from the plant, and you can determine where a person has interacted with that plant, how much they're interacting, whether they're pressing hard, multiple places. There are all kinds of gestures, infinite amount of gestures that you can use with Botanicus interacticus. So I've actually started doing this research myself. Disney Research performed this and released this last year in 2012. I've been talking about this concept for 2 years. So people thought that I was nuts at conferences before when I'd bring this up. I'm like, no. You're going to see plants in the next couple of years that will be user interfaces. People thought, yeah, whatever. You've been off researching far too much. But this is a reality. What we're actually seeing is a way to interact with new things that we never thought would be digitized. And we can now use those things in a way that allows us to interact with them over the internet. So you can actually take a plant, touch it, and in this example here, you have a mirror system that's also set up as a digitized mirror, so you can project images on it. When a user touches the plant, you see light emanations come from the places where you've touched the plant in the mirror, which is really cool stuff. They also designed another interface where if you click on certain parts of a bamboo shoot, you would change aspects of a regular graphical user interface. So it's almost as if you're using a mouse. Okay? Now, you think about that, and you say, okay, that's really, really cool. But how do you secure that? Because it's a freaking plant. There's no way to secure that technology, right? I mean, this is even worse than, the Microsoft issue, where Travis Goodspeed a couple of years ago found wireless keyboards from Microsoft had encrypted all their communications by XORing the MAC address with all the data. Obviously, that's a concern, and if we're really concerned about that, we're going to be even more concerned about this, because there's no way to secure the physical layer, right? And the only thing that somebody has to do to secure this, or to intercept this technology, is to stick another sensor in the ground somewhere near the plant and start receiving those signals, okay? So it's exciting because we're now seeing things that we never ever thought would be connected to the internet. We're now seeing the capability of things to be able to connect to the internet, but we're also seeing things that have no security surface whatsoever being connected. And the idea behind M2M security is, how do we create enough risk mitigation that even something like this can be implemented with little worry as to the effects. So M2M is basically bridging the physical world with the digital world and connecting things that shouldn't be connected to the internet, okay? Even things that are a little bit questionable, like maybe Google Glass. I'm not sure that's the greatest idea, but we'll find out. So the guide itself was built from a lot of different components in researching what M2M is. Obviously, we had to take, I developed my own Botanicus interacticus solution and analyzed what that really meant. We analyzed all different kinds of products from all over the world that were classified as M2M, and we wanted to determine what that meant. So to build the guide, we had to really understand, what are these companies doing to mass produce technology branded as M2M? okay? And so we ended up finding almost 100 different companies around the world that whose almost sole job, but a primary part of their business goal was to fuel, provide, etc., M2M services, products, or software. And we took their stuff, bought it in some cases, and analyzed the hell out of it and said, okay, well, what are the commonalities? We didn't want the academic books to tell us what M2M should be. We wanted to let the patterns emerge from empirical evidence, because usually the academic version of what things should be is very different from the practical and consumer side of what things are, right? So by analyzing over almost 100 companies, we were able to take enough information and find enough patterns to really determine what is M2M and what are the commonalities that allow us to analyze it. So we built a nice little constellation chart here that's weighted to determine where are the hottest regions in M2M? What are the hottest technologies that are relevant in M2M today? And these are them. The red areas you see are most prominent. The lighter red, you're getting less prominent, of course, down to blue, they're least relevant. And a lot of people were confused at first when we came out with this, because they were saying, well, the clouded internet seems to have so much to do with M2M. Yes and no. M2M is really more about integrating the physical object with the digital world. But whether you're using the cloud or the internet is really neither here nor there. It could just be, Wi-Fi to some centralized server in, say, an office environment or something of that nature. There's a backhaul, sure, but the backhaul doesn't have to go to the cloud. The backhaul can go anywhere. And the cloud is a separate thing amongst itself anyway, right? So we wanted to say, we're not talking about cloud security. We're talking about M2M. M2M is over here, cloud's over here. People also had a question about the SIM cards, because identity is crucial in M2M, and we absolutely agree. However, what's important to note is that identity in M2M has really very little to do with the SIM and very much to do with how you implement identity controls in general. SIM is just a methodology for implementing that. So we talk about the SIM and talk about attacks on the use of the SIM, but the SIM itself we're not attacking or threat modeling, right? So we're not going to attack the software on a SIM, but we're going to talk about how the SIM could be used improperly. So after analyzing all of those different pieces of technology, we came up with percentages of what is actually used according to companies that are out there. So the 100 companies are all actually broken down into about 4 primary technologies, as you see here. So this is primarily what we focused on, is saying this is M2M. And I want to very quickly clarify what this is. Cellular, you know what that is. It's going to be LTE, GSM, CDMA, EVDO, HSPA, whatever. Satellite, you already understand, either satellite data uplink, infrastructure, also GPS. And capillary communication is where things start to get interesting, because now you're taking all different kinds of disparate technologies, but they're usually all RF, and lumping it into one category and calling it capillary. This is very common in M2M, where you see, CAN bus, Zigbee, Z-Wave, Bluetooth, etc. All of these things can be capillary technologies or protocols, but the primary issue is that they're all very short distance. Okay, that's the most important thing about capillary technology. And then, of course, you have software. When I talk about software here, I'm not talking about bin/cat. Right? What I'm actually talking about is individuals or companies that are developing software specific to M2M, which can be operating systems, things of that nature. So to clarify these organizations, we needed to put them into their respective buckets. So any technology that's used in M2M, we basically placed all of the organizations within these buckets to say who owns particular verticals, who's migrating across separate verticals, because as you'll see in a little bit, this actually creates significant weaknesses that are different from embedded technology or wireless technology in other industries. There are far more significant risks in M2M. So that information is all in the guide if you want to check that out when we put that online. So the breakdown of the industries, we have 6 primary industries in M2M. And of course, everybody wants to create their own version of what this means. But this is like listening to techno, you know? Everybody wants to say, no, 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 it's Goa, no, 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 it's trance, no, 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 it's whatever. I don't care. It's techno, okay? For the purposes of what we're doing, it's techno. So in this case, we have 6 different buckets, and pretty much every single thing that we analyze can be thrown in one of these particular buckets. So we let the data and technology speak for itself. And then we applied some graphing metrics to just analyze what is the percentage of technology used per vertical, so we can see where weaknesses are. And what really very interesting that came out of this kind of analysis is the simple things that you normally wouldn't see unless you were analyzing large sets of data. The places where you see red, which is satellite technology, those are all indicative of verticals that have been around for the longest periods of time in M2M. Telematics is, of course, the most prominent. They've been around since the 80s. M2M technology and telematics has been around in the 80s in fleet tracking systems. So this was very interesting to see that the data actually reflects longevity. So we can actually pinpoint and identify if there's more red, it's a longer term M2M product. And why is that interesting? It's interesting because the risk is greater, okay? There's less security capability in older technology. Older technology is vulnerable to risks that have been solved in newer technology. Obviously, all of these issues are not fixed, but yet you're using technology that's decades old because you don't have anything else or you don't want to increase your expenses, okay? So that charting was actually pretty cool. So this entire company profiling allowed us to spend most of our time analyzing exactly whose products we needed to research and what those products really meant to the industry as a whole. Okay? It saved a ton of time. So if you're going to do this, I highly recommend just taking a couple of weeks to do just that research at the beginning, because it'll save you months later on. Another very interesting thing and important thing, I think, is the change in threat surface. Okay? So for embedded devices, as we all used to know, embedded systems are most vulnerable when you are physically in front of them. Right? This is obvious, but this is no longer true. What's very cool about M2M is that that paradigm actually flips. It does a complete 180. What occurs in M2M is the further you are from something, the more likely it is to be vulnerable, which is a very strange concept, but we found it consistently valid in M2M. The physical systems themselves can be tamper resistant. They're still going to be hackable, but you can put in all kinds of different mitigations to ensure that if something is tampered with, that an individual can't go very far with that tampering. However, because there are so many different types of RF technologies that are integrated into these systems, there are many, many different ways that you can break into these systems remotely. And I'm going to talk about a very interesting zero-day case later in this talk about how you can actually use that theory to migrate from one protocol to another within the same M2M device and compromise an entire swarm. So that's pretty interesting stuff. So while we're noting trends, I want to talk about the relationship model. As I mentioned earlier, relationships in M2M are extremely important when it comes to security. And this is different from almost every other industry that I've analyzed, that I know several other researchers have analyzed, especially cellular, things of that nature. Because when you're in a cellular environment, everybody knows you pick up a phone from the store, and if you're not in the US, it's probably unlocked, and if you are in the US, it's probably locked. And you're bound to a particular provider, but that provider has an OEM, and they have a relationship, a direct business relationship, and you have a direct business relationship with the provider. So if there's a security problem, you have a direct link to the person that's going to fix that problem for you. Okay? In M2M, it's very, very different. You're not only talking about disparate technologies that are working together, you're talking about disparate organizations. A manufacturer of a piece of technology may not directly ship it to a client or user. Okay, that's kind of common, but what's not common is that that technology may be shipped to the mobile virtual network operator, okay? And the mobile virtual network operator may resell or lease that equipment to the network provider. And they, in turn, share and lease the equipment, the network equipment, from the provider to provide you with networking services. And then they sell that equipment to another app vendor, and then the app vendor actually gives the product to the end user. So there's this very strange chain of organizations that all have a hand in getting your M2M device and service and product, whatever, to you. As a result, you have no way of actually getting the information on a risk or a threat to the organization that needs it directly, because you may have no idea who that is. Okay? So what's very important to note, and I experienced this personally when I reverse engineered a GPS tracking device, is that you can have a vulnerability in a GPS tracking device, and that vulnerability can be easily mitigated by the network owner. But you have no connection to the network owner, and you can't talk to the network owner directly about that product. You have to talk to the mobile virtual network operator, which may or may not find your issue relevant, and they may or may not hand off that particular issue to the network operator. So even if you have a valid issue, and even if it's acknowledged, it may take months for it to go through the appropriate channels for it to even be vetted, which is a serious problem, because now we're talking about M2M enabled systems which are physically tied systems. This means that this is technology that can potentially affect people's physical lives, and now we have longer time, longer latency in time between when you react to a particular vulnerability and when that particular vulnerability can be fixed. That's a problem. So the business relationship is serious when it comes to M2M, even though it's less of a risk in other industries. So the 6 primary industries in M2M, we did something very simple. We just said, okay, for each particular industry, we are going to simply, what? Find out what they're doing, right? Okay, so find out what organizations are going to be using this in this particular industry. Define what industrial use is going to be, what consumer use is going to be, and then obviously we can break down from that information what common components are going to be used across all these different organizations. And those common components are going to help us build our threat model. Because now we know everybody has to use a microprocessor, everybody has to use a capillary protocol, blah, 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 blah. All of those are key components in the way that you build the threat model, and if you use them as pieces, almost puzzle pieces, you can build a threat model from the ground up, or from the lowest layer up, very simply, okay? So we also identified known exploits, and we documented all known exploits for components and for technologies within the M2M risk assessment guide. So every time you pull that guide, you will now be able to see, here's the latest, greatest research on every single industry or every single vertical, blah, 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 that is affected by M2M. So the components themselves are key. And these products can actually be broken down into very simple pools, okay? You have either one of two things. You have either high-level components or low-level components. High-level components are conglomerates of low-level components. That's it. It's that simple. It doesn't have to be any more complex than that. We don't need to get, any more detailed. All we have to know is that there are 2 types of high-level components. They're either, or 2 classifications rather. They're either legacy or they're modern. Legacy M2M means that there's a very, very cheap, tiny microcontroller, probably 8-bit, probably an AVR, maybe an ST, maybe a TI. Regardless, there's going to be something extremely cheap that's running the application. And that's bad because those chips are easily ownable. You can own them via software, you can own them via hardware. There are always all kinds of ways to pull keys out of those types of devices. You can send one to Chris Karnofsky for a couple $1,000s. IOActive will immediately give you a firmware dump of whatever is on that. And now you probably have a key that works for every single one of those devices. So those things are extremely simple to attack. And yet we're seeing more and more of them, even though they're called legacy devices, because the cost is effective. So even though we should be seeing people migrating to modern M2M like Porsche and Porsche's PCM, that's a great example of how they're using embedded QNX to present a new digital dashboard for their Porsche 911s. we're not seeing as many organizations go to that because they don't have the money. Obviously, Porsche has the money because the users want to pay that money to get something cool. But everybody else just says, give me something cheap, I just need to track my fleet. I don't need some crazy digital dashboard for the guys in my semis drive down the street, right? So we're still going to see vulnerabilities for a long time based on the types of components that you use. And the low-level components are where the keys are. And by keys, I mean this is how everyone gets owned, okay? So as with many other types of technology, the issue here is that vulnerabilities always bubble up, right? And Spender will say this over and over and over for the Linux kernel, which is why GRSec was implemented for the Linux kernel, because the fundamentals of security must be enforced in order for the higher level objects to have any semblance of security whatsoever. We know this to be true in Linux. We see it failing every day in Linux. But we don't see that same parallel or acknowledge that same parallel in alternative technologies. And alternative technologies like M2M exhibit the exact same behavior. When you have vulnerabilities or components that are vulnerable at the lowest level, that will cause cascading vulnerabilities in higher level objects and cause products to be vulnerable for many years to come. So if you don't select the right components at the start of your product design, you will have a lifetime of vulnerability, especially in M2M when you're talking about embedded systems with a very long lifetime. You can design a product that will be used for the next 10 years, but if you design it wrong, you're never going to be able to field change any of that stuff, right? Nobody's going to come up with a magic operating system for the 8-bit AVR anytime soon. It's not going to be secure. That's just the way it is. You get what you pay for. So the low-level components themselves were broken down into buckets, okay? And we basically said, these are the buckets that define what a low-level component is. And then we basically said, all right, what does this low-level component mean from a risk perspective, right? And we basically built threat models for the low-level components, and that allowed us to elaborate on how to build simple threat models for higher-level components, and then integrate those threat models with network architecture that allows you to drop in your existing threat model to a solution and say, okay, if I'm now going to develop an e-health solution, I'm going to use these 6 components. They have this 6 risk profiles, and then I'm going to create my mitigations for those components, and then I'm going to move it into my higher level software and architecture, and so on and so on and so forth. You can use the threat models to basically recursively create mitigation strategies as you go higher and higher level. So what was very cool about this is we didn't just go as far as to say, here's a simple threat model, here are some risks, don't do these things. What we actually did is we went a little bit further and we said, here are some labs, and we defined an entire set of appendices. We have like 100 pages of labs on here's how you set up a lab for a cellular environment. Here's how you set up a lab for hardware. These are the steps that you need to take, even if you've never done this before. If you've never set up your own GSM base station environment, you will be able to using the labs in the M2M risk assessment guide, because we make it that simple. All you have to do is acquire the hardware, follow the lab, and now you have your own GSM hacking environment that you can use to audit M2M technology. So for every low-level component, we identified and defined and spec'd out with examples labs that allow people to say, what is the problem with this component? What are the potential issues? What are the potential mitigations? And now I have a way to walk through all of those things myself instead of just checking a field off in some kind of ISO 27001 style guide, which to us was insufficient. So my research partner Matthew Skinner and I defined this methodology to allow people to do things not only by our word, but themselves to evaluate and vet their solutions against what we have said. So we acknowledge that we may not always be right, but you can check for yourselves by using the labs. So we also ensure that all the known vulnerabilities for this particular technology, and also unknown vulnerabilities, as I'll talk about in the coming minutes, are going to be documented in the particular low-level component area. So by analyzing the components, we're able to deduce patterns in vulnerability, not only use, but in development, which I thought was pretty cool. So we can theorize what attacks are going to come in the future. And this was really excellent because it wasn't just about M2M at this point, right? Because we had so much data on low-level components, we had so much data on what was going to be used in the near future in products, we could actually say, all right, well, if Gemalto is starting to build swap outs for SIM cards, they have this new line of products called a MIM. And I'll talk about a MIM a little bit. I've talked about it before. It's the machine identification module. But it's a swap out for a SIM. A SIM's removable. Removable is a threat. I always talk about this example because I think it's hilarious, but there was a lady in New Zealand, and the lady in New Zealand broke open a smart meter, thinking that she was extremely smart, and took out the SIM card, put it in a cell phone, and started browsing the internet, downloading movies, and doing whatever the heck she was doing. She racked up $200,000 in expenses from just downloading videos that she wanted to see. And she thought she was doing this for free. And when they finally busted her, you know, that's a serious monetary loss for the organizations. Now you might think, well, these guys, you know, they can handle a couple $100,000, so it's probably not a significant hit. But when you think that a significant amount of people could have done the exact same thing, now you're talking about millions upon millions of dollars of losses. That's a significant problem. So the SIM card being removed or remove capable is a threat. Centurion defined a MIM, or a machine identification module, that's soldered onto the board. Okay? So when it's soldered onto the board, it's not capable of being removed easily. So what you can do is say, well, now I know I'm secure because this particular MIM is not going to be usable by anybody but this particular device. Well, that's not true, right? Because all it is a serial interface, and you can just remove it with a heat gun, and there you go. So there are really interesting techniques that we came up with that we had no idea that they were going to be useful in other areas of technology, but they absolutely are. One of them was remote glitching. And you might think, well, what is remote glitching? I'm sure a lot of people in here are hardware hackers or familiar with it at all. How many people here are familiar with glitching? Okay, good. A larger percentage than usual. So for those that don't know, glitching is basically the adjustment of voltage with the intent of tricking a CPU or some kind of chip into thinking that data that's being interpreted is different than what it is. In other words, if it thinks that a certain level of voltage means 1 and a different level of voltage means 0, if a fuse is blown and that fuse is set to 1, by adjusting voltage you can essentially trick it into thinking that that value is 0 instead of 1. And that allows you to bypass locks and blown fuses and things of that are usually enabled for protection in chips. Okay? So if you have a certain microcontroller, you blow a fuse and now you cannot read memory from that. You can't dump the flash from that without paying Chris Tarnovsky a couple $1,000s. Okay? But what you can do is you can use glitching or adjusting voltage to force this to occur using software, which is really fun. Then of course there's simple power analysis and differential power analysis, but I'm not going to get into all that. But what's cool about this is now you have dual technology that is RFID capable. Okay, and by dual I mean there's an I2C interface and an RF interface. The RF interface is 13.56 megahertz, right? Which allows you to speak to it over RFID. But what's interesting is that these are very rudimentary chips. They don't have a lot of voltage protection because the individuals that sell these components are also selling the products that are used to program them. So one example is the ST line. The ST has the M24, and basically this line is another dual interface where you can start flashing EEPROM over an RFID interface. But what's cool about that is if you actually have voltage technology or RFID technology where you can adjust the voltage, you can actually cause glitching to occur over this interface because there isn't sufficient protection inside the die to ensure that the EEPROM isn't poorly affected by attacks against the RFID side. Okay, so this is a really excellent technique, and somebody, I can't see who, but I believe that somebody will be talking about this very thing within the next year, at least, If they don't do it, then I probably will, but I'm going to be slow at this, so it might take me a couple of years longer than this particular individual. But this is something that we came up with by actually looking at the low-level components, threat modeling them, and saying, what are the potential issues? This was found as being a practical threat. And now somebody is actually going and taking the time to do this and actually is starting to have success. That's brilliant. We've never seen this kind of attack before, but now we're going to start seeing more and more of this style attack because the technology is becoming more robust. It's becoming more widely available in products all over the world. Another very interesting technique is the zero-day baseband attack against GPS. And I was very proud to come up with this attack scenario because according to the threat modeling that we did of M2M, we noticed that there's a very interesting trend in GPS manufacturing. That it wasn't a separate chip anymore. So you didn't have a separate die upon which a GPS firmware sits. You now are more tightly integrating the GPS module into the cellular baseband. And of course, a light went off in my head and I said, wait a second. So the same baseband that's running GSM is now interpreting frames from GPS. Well, as you probably are familiar, GPS is unencrypted for civilians. So every single L1 packet that you get from GPS satellite is unencrypted for 99.9% of the modules out there in the world. Okay? And it's a very, very simple protocol. But it's a simple protocol in the payload format. It's a very difficult protocol in the way that you actually implement the physical layer. So nobody had ever done it before. But we said, wait a second, this actually starts to sound feasible. We have usurps. We've got fast usurps being made. We know that the technology is possible. I guarantee academics can do this. And now that the GSM baseband is on the same die as GPS baseband in some cases, migration from attacking one platform to another is useful. That creates a need, an offensive need. And next thing we knew, CMU in December of this past year came out with a paper saying we have successfully performed this attack. So they have successfully gained remote code execution over GPS onto a GPS baseband. That is phenomenal. That's probably some of the most exciting offensive research I have heard about in years. Okay? Especially with the migration of firmware to GSM firmware. And this is going to be important for everyone because you guys know GPS is really important for GSM because of timing. Right? Because GSM is all based on time slices. It's also extremely important for CDMA, right? If you throw a GPS or if you spoof GPS around a CDMA tower, you will DDoS that tower. You will corrupt the entire cell that CDMA cell is sitting in, okay? So that's extremely important stuff. So that is extremely interesting technology. And by doing simple threat modeling and low-level components, we were able to identify these threats before they became known in public. And I love the fact that I can actually document this because I sent this out to DARPA 6 months before the public release of that CMU paper. So I was all excited about like, oh, I have proof. I swear I came up with it. Not really, because they had been doing the research for like a year before that. It took them a really long time. But I felt cool anyway. So another issue is rootless SSL. Okay? And this I've actually talked about before, but it's getting worse. So I needed to bring it up again. M2M modules are popping up everywhere. And I had a phone conversation before Black Hat Las Vegas last year with Ralph Philip Weinman. He and I were kind of trading notes on, we were both hacking GPS and location-based software. And he had performed one style of attack, which was brilliant, and he talked about it a bit at Black Hat, and he gave me a shout out at Black Hat for the stuff that I was doing, but I didn't really get to talk about what I was doing. And I'm still not going to talk about what I was doing too much right now, but I will say that where it gets really interesting is when you combine location-based data with SSL in rudimentary handsets. Think about it this way. You've got SSL provided to you by a baseband. That's the chip that drives your cellular technology, right? What's interesting is very, very cheap cell phones use these same technologies. Usually basebands they're manufactured for one thing or another. So basebands for the cellular market are all marketed for one, manufactured by one organization or another organization, but they're all marketed separately. And then you've got M2M basebands, which are all over here, and they're not really used in phones. What's very strange is that the M2M side, because they're cheaper, they're tiny, and they're starting to integrate other technologies like integrating TCP/IP. They have TCP/IP stacks in the baseband on those M2M modules. Those are becoming more popular in rudimentary cellular handsets. And why is that really important? Because millions of people use very cheap rudimentary cell phone handsets. Where? India, Africa, the Middle East, Asia. Everywhere that's basically a third world country, you will see a massive amount of small rudimentary handsets using basebands that have integrated TCP/IP stacks and integrated SSL and TLS stacks. And none of those stacks have a root certificate store. None of them. And when you're starting to think, wait, third world country, India, Africa, wait, what service is really popular over there? Oh yeah, banking over phones. All those applications are using baseband TCP/IP and SSL stacks that don't have the ability to certify. That's not good. So when we talked about it before, we didn't realize that this was becoming an issue. So you take location-based services, pool it together with SSL-based applications like banking, put in the context of third world countries that use massive amounts of these cheap cell phones, and you have a very serious, serious problem. And of course, I talked about the MIM a little bit. The MIM is, again, this is just a SIM card but in a different format. It's very tiny, it's soldered directly onto the PCB, but this thing can just be popped right off and you can use it on a different application. Or what you can do, and what I like to do, and that's part of the guide that teaches you how to do this, is you can actually just take your own SIM card that's writable, buy one from Harold Welt. I probably just butchered his last name. But buy one from the Osmocom guys, and then you just flash the same parameters onto that SIM card, and you pop the SIM card into a SIM reader, and then you forward the TX and RX points and the UARTs to that SIM reader, and now you have the ability to simulate a MIM with the same parameters, but that forcibly attaches to your network because your network is the only one that will authenticate it because your internal key is different. So that's extremely useful. So the MIM bypass is really important because it allows researchers and embedded analysts to very quickly usurp technology that they otherwise think is secure. So to summarize the guide itself, we basically took industrial overview, right? Looked at all the different kinds of containers or verticals that could be used in M2M, broke them down, looked at their common components, saw who owned those components, as in the manufacturer who's distributing them, looked at the relationships, looked at the threat model of building the relationships, and created a guide that allows you to pick components that are used if you want to build your own components or build your own M2M system, or it allows you to pick components that are in an existing thing that you need to reverse engineer, and then apply an associated threat model to that. We have the exploit survey and the laboratory setups and all the other good things that we have. But I have a couple extra things that I thought would be cool to drop here at Black Hat. We found a couple very cool tools while we were doing this, because part of the whole risk assessment project was to figure out what's the best tool to use for auditing this particular technology. Well, everybody has been going on and on for years. We don't have a valid Zigbee test platform. We need a better Zigbee test platform. So we found one. The 802.15.4 protocol doesn't just allow Zigbee and Z-Wave and all the other things that you know. It also allows a protocol called Snap. Snap is made by Synapse, which is a pretty innovative company. What they've done is they've minimized a virtual machine for Python, and then they've put that virtual machine into small little AVRs and things of that nature, so that you basically have an on-chip Python interpreter that you can send scripts to. So your M2M environment is now capable of ingesting Python scripts right on the sensors, which is pretty sweet. But what they did was they designed their own modules and they're really cheap. They're about 20 bucks, but you get 3 miles line of sight with these Zigbee modules that you can't get with other modules that are known to be useful in Zigbee hacking. Like Josh Wright's talk, he focused on the AVR USB, which is a great little platform, but it doesn't get a lot of mileage. It doesn't have, the antenna is PCB embedded. It's very weak. But this guy, you can actually put a very robust antenna right here on this little red end, this capped end, and now you have 3 miles line of sight with a very, very strong Zigbee tool. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to upload to our Git repository. So just check our Twitter feed. We're at Caphill Security or www.capitolhillconsultants.com, or follow me at Don Andrew Bailey. And I'll dump the Git details on the next couple of days. And I'll upload open source the software for running the sniffer and injector and all the other good stuff on this, because it's different than Killer Bee. Killer Bee is closed source. So Josh didn't release the actual code. He only released the firmware image for AVRs, whereas I'm actually going to release the full code so you can play around with it, augment it, and do whatever you want. Another really cool thing was the RF-USB 1 by Monet. Now, Monet are the people that originally came up with the XB, who you guys are probably familiar with, because that's a great sensor platform. Very well popularized by the Arduino. They sold XB to Digi, and then went off and tried to do their own, like a new thing. Well, they said, we want smaller modules. So they started using the Texas Instruments CC1111 and the 1110. But they put it in a really great format. It's a RF USB, just a standard USB dongle, but it's tiny. It's like this big, okay? But what's great about it is it has taps on it, and that's probably like the worst soldering job I've ever done, so don't judge me for that. But you can flash it very easily with your own software, and because USB is directly hooked up to this chip, and this chip, the CC1111, has USB capability in it, you just write your own quick little driver, and there are examples on how to do that online. You now have your own sniffer with an embedded whip antenna, which no other CC1111 platform has, okay? So this will actually get you more mileage than almost any other CC platform out there that's around the same price point. This is a little bit more expensive than the Synapse Snap module. This is around like 40 to 50 USD, but it's worth the money because it's stronger than the other modules that are similar. So the other labs that we have, I just wanted to briefly note, are kind of cool. We just did hardware analysis. Like if you've never done logic analysis before, this will be a walkthrough on how to do that, how to dump memory, how to dump information from one process to another. It's very important to do that in M2M auditing. You'll see why in the guide, but this is a walkthrough on how to do that. It'll teach you how to use oscilloscopes, how to do general hardware reversing, even how to use hypodermic needles to tap into certain pins that you could not otherwise tap when you're doing hardware reverse engineering. That's a really useful thing to do. Just don't prick yourself, because I swear to you, I have like 50 new holes on this hand because of hypodermics. But again, I think the most important thing here is the cellular stuff. A lot of people don't understand how to set up their own cellular networks, and we give you a walkthrough on how to exactly do that. And hopefully in the near future, we actually, not for the DARPA project, but separate to the DARPA project, we reverse engineered a CDMA femtocell for the US, and we're actually considering, we need to do this properly, so we have to go through the right channels, but we're hoping to release the techniques for doing that to the public so that people can actually use a CDMA femtocell instead of just GSM to do M2M research, because M2M research is also applicable to CDMA, especially not just in the US, but especially China, actually, and Singapore. But also, we need to add on an LTA section, or LTE section, because Fabrice Ballard finally created a deal with a company that he co-founded, and now they're releasing LTE baseband software for Node Bs, I think, for like 4,500 euro, which is actually a pretty decent price because they give you the full source code. So that's pretty cool. So to summarize, the M2M risk assessment guide was a very difficult and lengthy process to build because we had to analyze so much information from companies and the components they make. It cost us a ton of time, but it was absolutely worth it because the guide will now take the experiences that we've had and provide anybody that wants to with the ability to quickly reverse engineer a product that's already been deployed or a product that's in development, which means that this can be used by engineers, this can be used by security analysts, this can be used by even hobbyists that want to learn how to design their own technology, which is part of the reason why we did this, because we don't just want to fuel security. Security is very important. Security is what we do. But we also want to help people innovate and help people build. And this is a great way that people that want to get into developing M2M solutions and innovate, things in the world, they can use this guide as almost a way to say, like, okay, how do I build my own lab? How do I design my own architecture that's going to be sound to be used by the public? This is a good way to do that. So also to summarize, I wanted to do a quick brief on Cyber Fast Track because these guys were amazing. They were great support to us, and we had so much fun being able to work with the DARPA team, Mudge, and Bit Systems on this particular project. So quick shout out to them. So thank you to those guys for making this possible. The future efforts, I think, very quickly, we're out of time by 24 seconds, so I'll be very brief. But I think what's really important to note here is that the guide as we've developed it is extremely different from all the academic books and the material that you will read from Etsy, 3GPP on M2M security. We have basically a comprehensive component-based guide on threat modeling for M2M. Whereas if you read any of their material, it's going to focus on identity, confidentiality, integrity, and authentication, which is fine, and those things are important, but that's only a very small piece of what M2M security really is. So our goal is going to be to take the M2M risk assessment guide and use it to fuel standards through Etsy, through GPP, et cetera, to hopefully ensure that organizations out there aren't just using the guide to help them internally, but are using it as a guide to help develop M2M technology for the long term. So I just want to leave you with a thought that it does only take one vulnerability to break through technology like this, because we don't see a mesh of security here, right? This is a chain, and it's a very unfortunate chain. But if you hack any link of that chain, it's a hacked chain, right? And it's something that we always talk about in security, but we have to constantly pound this idea back into people's minds. So it's important that even though everybody in this audience, I'm sure, already understands this, vocalize this to the peers that you have in these kinds of engineering environments, because they're not quite seeing it yet. They see a mesh that doesn't exist because there are so many moving components in M2M and so many different organizations that need to talk together to create a solution. It creates a false sense of mesh security in their mind when it's still just a simple chain. Okay. So, thank you to everybody here in the audience. I appreciate you coming to see my talk. And thank you to everybody here, especially Mudge and Loft, because if it wasn't for Mudge and it wasn't for the Loft team, even Chris Wysopoli, he's somewhere here, I probably wouldn't be here. So big thanks to them, and thanks to DARPA and the Bit Systems guys for helping me start my own company, and especially to Matt Skinner, my co-founder at Capitol Hill Consultants, my wife Jessica, and Dan Guido, who helped initially with some of the preparation for putting together our CFT submission. And especially thank you to everybody here at Black Hat for supporting me. This is my 7th Black Hat talk, so I'm very proud for this particular talk to be my 7th, 7 being a lucky number. So thanks to everybody at Black Hat, and thanks to all of you. If anybody has a question, feel free to shout out. We may be out of time, so I apologize. Anybody? If you want, you can catch me anytime during the conference. If you see me, just grab me and we can have a conversation. But you probably need to get to your next talk. So thanks again for your time. I appreciate it.